think all of you know that I'm Paul from Larne Camera Club, keen photographer, also an astronomer, and I keep the TV and radio working with my day job. I'm just going to talk about compact and bridge cameras, the next step up really from a phone. And you've got a few choices of things to do. You can go all the way and get into DSLRs and mirrorless cameras if you want, and Mark's going to talk about that in about a month's time, isn't it, Mark? I think 4 weeks today or something like that. But why would you want to move up from your phone? Most people are using phones for photography these days. Why would you want more, and what more would something different give you? So start off really with a sort of compact, small, simple camera. There used to be loads of those about. They just had a simple short zoom, 3 or 4 times zoom, does a bit more than the phone but not a lot more, and really phones have more or less taken over that end of the market. The number of small compact cameras for not very much money on the market now is quite few. Things have sort of stepped up a bit, and that's really what it's mostly going to cover here. I'm just going to mention something that digital cameras come with different sensor sizes, and really it sort of starts at the bottom and works up to, so something with a big full frame sensor like that whole area there, 24 by 36 millimeters, is that's a full frame sensor, and you're looking at a lot of money and a lot of size and a lot of weight for a camera that has that. So mostly in compacts there's 3 main sizes, and it's the ones at the bottom right there. 1/2.3 is the sensor in your phone. It's a little sensor. 1/1.7 is a bit bigger, and some compact cameras use that. And now there's a lot of cameras use the 1-inch sensor, which is the third one up there. And that's as far as I'm going to go today. I'm not going to talk about anything outside of that, like 4/3 APS-C, full frame. That's beyond what I'm going to talk about today. So those are the sizes, and it makes a big difference. It's the first decision made in the construction of a camera, what sensor, and everything like the size of the lens and the size of the camera stems from that decision. And why would you want bigger? Because they're better. All other things being equal, a big sensor beats a little one every time. So just be aware of sensor sizes. I'll mention it a bit more. Here's a good category of camera to start off with, and that's what's called an enthusiastic compact. And what you've got there is most of the stuff that you would get built into an SLR, except put in a compact body. And I've just picked out 3 of sort of the main market leaders there. There's the Sony RX100 series, and what they've done with that is quite good in a way that there's now 7 of them. And they made one about 10 years ago, which was the first 1-inch sensor camera. And then they started adding features to them, and they still make them all. So you can buy the bottom end one if you want, just want a basic camera, and it goes all the way up to about £1,000 for they're up to the RX107 now, which is an all singing, all dancing. Got quite a long zoom on it. It's got a pop-up viewfinder on the back. It's got everything. Other cameras available, of course. Canon make one there, and that one's got a flip-up screen. So if you want to do selfies, like that, you can see what you're doing. Likewise has the LX15 there, and I'll show you how big an LX15 is, because it so happens I've got one. This is an LX15 Panasonic, and it's that big. So it's adequate. It's not quite jacket or shirt pocket, but it's jacket pocket certainly. Ladies' handbag even. And it's got this screen, so I can do selfies here. You can see I've modified this one. I've got a dog hair on top of there that means that I can, if I do it in the wind, I can still hear the voice there. It's that amazing. It's not very big, but it's an amazingly good wind filter on top of there. It costs a couple of pounds, and it's just stuck on the top of the microphone. But this has got, you see, it's got all the mode dials and everything, so it does everything. It's even got an aperture ring, this one. Good old-fashioned aperture ring around the lens. And that lens, it's only a 3 times zoom, so it's not a big range. but it is a very good lens, and I'll show you something from it a bit later. But that's that sort of class of camera. Now, what are you going to do with it? Well, let's have a thing here. There's a thing, I'll talk about this concept called the exposure triangle, and it's important to actually understand this when you've got manual control over a camera, because it gives you all sorts of options to adjust things and get things exactly right, depending on what you want to achieve. And so you've got three things. You have the f-stop of the lens, so the lens has an iris in it, and it contracts down like that to either let lots of light through or not very much light through. And it depends on the design of the lens, just how much light you can get through it. And that affects the properties of the image that you get very much. Shutter speed is how long you expose your picture for. And that can be a short time or a long time. Reasons why you'd use both of those. And then you have a third option, sensor sensitivity. Now, in the old days of film, you made that decision in the shop. When you bought your film, it was ISO 100 or 400 or whatever it was, and all the pictures you were going to take would be like that. With digital sensors, you can change it differently for every picture. You can have high sensitivity, low sensitivity. Those three things come together to give you an exposure in the middle there. And I'll sort of try and explain why you do one thing or another, but have a look there. So these are the ways you can do the camera modes. Any professional type camera, enthusiast, compact or SLR, will have really four main modes. One is the program mode. That's easy, automatic, put it there, the camera just will sort everything out for you. There's variations on program modes that are generally called scene modes or something, which is a variation on the same thing, where the camera will make all the decisions for you, but based on whether you've made a selection for a scene type. So that would be sports or portrait or landscape or whatever, and the camera will make choices that it deems appropriate. Aperture priority. This is, I think most enthusiast photographers would regard this as their favourite mode. You set the lens aperture and then let the camera do the rest. And that's important because it's the lens aperture has a huge bearing on what the picture looks like, and I'll give you some examples shortly. Then we have also shutter priority. You decide the shutter speed, the camera does the rest. And manual, you decide everything. ISO you can set to manual or auto. I tend to have it manually myself because I just like to have that degree of control over what the sensor is really doing. Shutter speeds, range of shutter speeds, you can have shutter speeds on this little camera here from 60 seconds up to a 4,000th of a second. So very short, 4,000th of a second is not a long time at all. 60 seconds is a hugely long exposure for which you would need a tripod. So I've got there. Apertures, this is a 1.4 lens on here, very bright aperture, lets lots of light in, or right down to f32, which is hardly any light at all goes through the lens. So if you wanted to have a long exposure, you'd end up having a small aperture in bright light, and vice versa. So give you a bit more about that. 1,000th is a great sort of shutter speed to freeze action. If you're trying to catch, someone running and you want them to look like they're standing still, 1,000th of a second is great. Just take pictures like that. If you want to see them a bit blurred, then you'd give it a short, let's say a smaller number, like a 500th or a 1/2/5. And then if someone running, you'd see their legs moving at that point. And that might be a more effective photograph to convey the issue of movement. Something like flowing water. I'll show you a picture of Gleno in a minute, taken at two different shutter speeds, just to give you an impression of what difference that makes. And one other thing that's essential for worrying about shutter speeds is if you're hand holding your camera. there is a rule. I'm not really doing maths here. That's just a little equation there. But your focal length divided by your shutter speed should be less than 1, and that probably sounds like gibberish, but what it's saying is that if you've got, say, a 50mm focal length lens, to keep that still, you want a shutter speed of at least 1/50th of a second. And likewise, if you've got a longer telephoto lens, say a 200mm, then don't be using that under a 200th of a second. One slight proviso with that these days is that modern cameras tend to have some form of stabilization built into the camera, and it gives you just a little bit more leeway with that figure. So, I mean, I have things that I should have done at a 50th of a second, I have done at a quarter, because you can. And not every time it will work, so do a couple of pictures if you're going to do things like that. But stabilization is a fairly modern thing in cameras, and it makes it good. Aperture. Now, wide open aperture. This is 1.4. Lets lots of light in, and it also, the way it affects the picture is that your depth of field, that is to say, what is in focus. If you're focused on, say, here, then a narrow depth of field means that, say, from here to here might be in focus. The aperture stopped right down to a very small amount of light going through the lens also means that your depth of focus goes right like that. You can set it so that you can have everything from the front to the back of the picture in focus. All other things being equal. Once you start going into longer focal lengths, it gets harder to achieve full front to back focus. But you can move it in that direction. And you do it, why you do it and why people like wide aperture lenses is that you can focus on something, like, say, a flower, and have the flower in perfect focus and everything behind it blurred, and it makes the object stand out in the picture. So that's a bit of that. So that's a bit more of this. Narrow apertures, depth of field, object sharp from front to back, and ISO, the effect of ISO on the picture. Well, if you keep the ISO, your sensitivity, it's why they don't use the word sensitivity, I don't know, because ISO just stands for International Standards Organization, which doesn't really mean anything other than the name of the body that defines it. But sensitivity, if you keep the sensitivity of the sensor low, you get nice clean images, hardly any grain, bright colors, good dynamic range, i.e. good contrast between dark and bright areas. And as you increase the sensitivity of the sensor, and also as you reduce its size, of course, those things sort of start to become less good. You get picture grain, not quite such good distinction between light and dark. Sometimes the color saturation will drop off, depending on how they've dealt with that. And the smaller your sensor, the smaller your camera, the worse that is, really. Full frame cameras can really go to quite high sensitivities now, and you won't even tell the difference. But smaller cameras, smaller sensors, ISO 400 is probably fairly usable on most cameras these days. You start going to 800 and things get just a little bit grainy, then more so at 1600. Some of them actually go up to absurd numbers. This camera goes up to an ISO of 25,600. That setting was put in there by the marketing people because it's of no practical use whatsoever. There are times when you have to do it. Now, I did a set of photos with an even smaller camera than that, actually. I went down the Marble Arch caves, which, if you haven't done it, go, because it's great. But hardly any light down there and no tripods allowed. So to actually get handheld exposure, something I had to use, even with a little camera, ISO 3200, and it did it quite well, actually. I shot it raw so I could process it later, and it did reasonably. But sometimes those are the circumstances you find yourself in, and that's what you have to do. Just really a word about all the different focal lengths you can do. This is not a very, it's not. See, the lens there changes length a little bit, but it's not huge. It's only a 3x zoom, 24 to 72. in 35mm equivalent terms, this one. That camera over there is far more useful for that sort of thing. We'll look at that in a minute, because that's a 25 to 600 zoom, and it's constant aperture right the way through. But focal length wide is great if you want to take the whole view out of that window. 24mm will do that for you. If you want to sort of zoom in on some of the football players there, 600 will do that for you. Taking pictures of people, here's an important thing. Do not take pictures of people with a wide angle lens, because they look horrible, because it actually exaggerates the perspective between their nose and the rest of their face. So it looks like sort of Pinocchio, and the rest of the face looks that it's further away than it is. And always use at least 50mm for taking pictures of people, and preferably 70 to 100 for portraits. Many people for years just sort of swore by the 85mm lens for taking pictures of people. It's what it's for, and it's very good at it. So that's that. Now I'm going to look at some pictures. Here's two examples. That's the waterfall at Leno, and I just stood in front of it and pointed a camera at it and took two pictures, one at 250th of a second. You see the water there is frozen in a moment in time, pretty much. There's not much movement visible there, but on the other hand, at a 25th, i.e. 10 times longer exposure, it's moving. It's obviously moving. And I've sort of come to the conclusion with waterfalls that about a second is good, second or two, depending on the individual waterfall. Some go faster than others and so on, but that's the sort of thing. That's what your shutter can do in terms of fast or slow shutters. This is just over the road there, taken with this little camera. Picture number one at f2. You can see that the flower in the middle is clear, but actually the one down in front and the whole background of chain tower and so on there is all blurred. But stop this down to f8, and now the flower in front is clear, and the chain tower is fairly clear as well. So that you see there's much more depth of focus in that picture. Travel zooms and bridge camera. Well, here this is an enthusiast zoom. The next level up, there's a travel zoom. They've invented camera categories for every thing here. And the idea of the travel zoom, it was actually more or less invented for me. I went to California in 2010, and I had a Sony Alpha 700 camera and a big bag of lenses. And I took some great pictures, of course did, but I kind of swore that I was never doing this again, because it actually becomes your holiday, and it's not really that, that's not quite what you're going to do. So I did actually, after that, I bought, a quite small bridge camera, a thing called an FZ38, my first Panasonic, and I kind of got into Panasonics at that point because I liked them. And that had, that big bag of stuff in one small package, and that was what I wanted to go on holiday. And I've sort of changed that a bit now. I have a micro 4/3 system, which is itself quite portable, and the camera I pick up to take places is that one there. That's an FZ300 bridge camera, Panasonic, and it does everything. It does absolutely everything. It just does it not quite as well as if I'd spent 10 times as much money on a whole system, and it's. But the difference isn't that huge. And going out for the day, that I want a camera that will do anything, but I'm not that fussed about ultimate quality. That'll do. There are lots of sorts of these now, particularly the travel zooms. Everyone's got a travel zoom, every maker. And they're some of them are 10 times, some of them go up to 40 times. Now there's a Canon that's a travel zoom that's got a 40 times lens in it, 24 to 960. Who wants more than that ever? Well, actually, Nikon think you do, because they make a bridge camera. See my bridge camera there? That's quite small by Nikon standard. They make a thing called the P1000 that's about this long, and it's got a 3000mm lens on it, a 24 to 3000 zoom.
That's got 30 watches.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's too long for the moon. Even the whole moon won't fit in that. It's quite a magnificent thing. I've known that's 24 times, and that's enough for me, because even that 24 times holding it still, at the long end, even though it's got a very good image stabilizer, and it's not, it's something you've got to think about. But that's what they do. So there's a travel zoom. That's a thing called a TZ90, a Panasonic, and it is the same size as this actually, but it's just got a smaller sensor and a longer lens in it, and that's the design choice they've made. Same concept of flippy up screen. As you see, that's quite a long lens in 3 sections that zooms to. That's a 24-720 lens, so pretty good. Next to it, the bridge camera, and that is my bridge camera there. That's an FZ330, 25-600. That's only a 12 million pixel sensor, which is absolutely enough for most purposes. The travel zoom, they've bumped it up to 20 million pixels. Probably, again, one of those things that the marketing people insisted it had to be that. It doesn't really make any difference. As you get more pixels onto the same size chip, the pixels themselves get smaller, and so the noise of the sensor increases. It's just, it's a trade-off of things, but they do produce nice sharp pictures. So that's really those two sorts of camera. They are, instead of one of those, instead of either of those, by the way, you'd be looking at about £450 new, either of them. They're both about the same price. They do similar things. I would say that the bigger and bulkier camera is the better one. It just does more. It has a brighter lens certainly on it. But instead of either of those, you could have that, and that's a Nikon D700 full frame system. But that would be about 5,000 or 6,000 probably you're looking at there with those lenses, and imagine taking that on holiday. It would become, you'd have a backpack and that would just be your camera, wouldn't you? And that's really what I gave up when I started going to smaller cameras. I just sort of thought, yeah, this is great, but it's kind of wrecking my holiday. So and as you say, you can buy that or a good second-hand car for the price of that, I think. So that's why I tend to shut. But anyway, Mark will convince you next time why you should do that, maybe, because actually, in terms of ultimate quality, that beats the living daylights out of a little one. But it's a choice you make. Wide and long zooms, 25 millimeters. That's I've got really quite close to the Guildhall in Londonderry there, and it's a feature. It's not a fault. It's not a distortion. It's just a feature of if you stand close to a building in front of it with a wide lens, and to get the whole of the top in, you end up pointing the camera upwards. You do get converging verticals. That's just geometry. That actually all those vertical lines, they come to a point somewhere in the sky, somewhere there. It's not a fault. That's just a feature of what you're doing. At the other end of the zoom, that little camera there took that picture of the moon, on which you can see American flags and astronauts' foot. No, you can't, but yes, I did. Yeah. The moon just fascinates me because my entire interest in space and everything came from when men were walking on the moon, and so I just look at the moon and think people have been there. People are going there again quite soon, I think, if they ever get Artemis off the ground. But so that's what that range of lens can do. A Nikon P1000 would zoom in 5 times closer than that, but whether you'd be able to hold it still for long enough to get the picture, I don't know. That's just outside my house, but that's again same place. Yeah, if I'm not sure if lasers work on, they don't at all. But there's a little crabapple tree outside my house, and if you look at sort of a little bit of the left side of it, then that's it. magnified 24 times just by not moving but just zooming in. So that's the range you get with that sort of camera, and that to me is enough. You know, I don't really need much more than that. I don't think. I'd like to get a bit closer to the moon. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to ask the question: having gone out and taken your pictures, what do you do with them? And so I'm going to just go and fire this up, and I'll just show you my favourite bit of software. Now, this is the Firestone image viewer, and what's good about this is it's free for personal use. So it's firestone.org, and this is the most brilliant piece of software, I think, because it works in a different way from most image viewers. There's just all sorts of stuff that happens to be on my desktop there, none of which means anything much really. But so is there anything in here or anything else that anyone wants me to explain particularly?
Well,